1899. And we talked about him previously, but he's the one that really led our maturing as a historical society. So there's that book of the room with the newspapers in it. And then a few years later, we were collecting 3D items, artifacts for a museum collection. So by 1879, we were the trustee of the state for the purpose of maintaining the state's history. Within 10 years, we'd collected more than 16,000 books, pamphlets, more than 3,700 bound volumes of newspapers and periodicals. So we also had launched a quarterly publication. And so we were growing rapidly. But there's another way of telling history in a story, and that is by actively preserving the sites and places, the buildings where history actually happened. So for a little bit of national context, New York is usually credited with being the first state. They acquired Washington's headquarters in 1850, 4 years before we were even a territory here in Kansas. And then in 1858, the Mount Vernon's Ladies Association saved George Washington's home. So we've all heard the old joke about George Washington sleeping here, right? Well, there is a lot of truth that significant individuals in our history have led to the preserving of historic sites, including kind of obliquely our first state historic site. So here's just a timeline that's thrown up of starting in 1901 up until this year of the acquisition of our state historic sites. There's not all of them on there, and we'll talk about that. And there's numerous ways to count. Right now, we claim there's 17 state historic sites. So we'll get to that here in a second. But the first was Pawnee, what we call Pawnee Indian Museum, state historic site near Republic in 1901. The land was actually deeded to us in 1899. So if you see some date and you've got another date, well, there's often when we acquire it, when the legislation happens, which was 1901. So this came about, and if you read our bi-monthly newsletter, Zephyr, I wrote a little bit about Elizabeth Johnson. I don't know if I have a laser pointer. She's on the lower first row in the white. In the 1870s, she became enamored with Pike and read his journals. And she was wanting to find the remains of the Pawnee village where Lieutenant Pike was said to have raised the U.S. flag for the first time in Louisiana Purchase or Kansas Territory in 1806. So she found what she thought was the site. She found an intact Pawnee village and purchased 160 acres to prevent it from being destroyed by cultivation. So in 1899, she deeded 11 acres to the state with a condition that the land be fenced and a suitable marker installed. And this suitable marker installed is a recurring thread in us receiving. So not many of them, that was the sign. She got her name on the fence. That's the fence. AD 1901, donated to the state. So in 1901, 2 well-attended public ceremonies were held to dedicate the site. On the 4th, July 4th, the cornerstone was laid and unveiled later on September 30th. Intended to be the anniversary of Pike's visit, but the 29th was on a Sabbath that year, which is interesting since we have a statute on the book saying that our museum should be open on Sunday, right?
Yes.
So, so there's the monument, lots of flags. But the interesting thing is, as early as the 1920s, there began to be doubts that this really was the site that Pike visited. In fact, there was a contention that it was in Nebraska to the north, right, and it was called the Nebraska-Kansas War. And back and forth academic arguments began. Even Waldo Wadle, the famous Kansan archaeologist with the Smithsonian, wrote in 1936 that this wasn't it. So we eventually more or less conceded it. But their site was destroyed by cultivation. And we had, even by aerial photos before LiDAR, you could tell the circles for the village site. So I guess we switched purposes. You can see the monument and started excavating the houses to interpret the site as a Pawnee village. So the Coxsackie band of Pawnees had settled there in the 1700s and occupied it with their earthen lodges, dome shaped. Some of them were as large as 60 feet in diameter. So there were numerous archaeological investigations there, 33, 49, 57, 65 and 66, they were serious by our archaeology department, which has then been created for what we're about to see, was the creation of a specific visitor center that was erected over one of the lodges, house number 5. I think it was the first time they got to excavate a prehistoric site indoors, what Tom Leddy said. So we got some land, water, and conservation money for that. So we'll talk a little bit about the late 60s and the move toward visitor centers when we get to Hayes. But I want to jump in so we can get to your tenure because, you know, the tornado here. The monument, by the way, was hit by at least 3, if not 4 tornadoes and damage. I think someone's trying to tell us something maybe about the site. But this was in your period. 2004 is the most recent, and it did damage the village, although our architect at the time, Dan Prosser, said he thought the round building helped.
Yes,
it really couldn't
bounced
grab it.
the tornado
off of it. Well, Terry, this is a good time to bring you up to speed. We've got a lot of ground to cover here later, and we may not get through all of it. But as the sites came through, when you were started in preservation, then you became the facilities architect. Then when Dr. Powers became executive director, we planned the facility for this building, which you oversaw, this construction. Things were reorganized. So tell us a little bit how sites were administered before and then what it became.
We have to remember up until Raymond came on, the sites were really managed by the assistant director of the agency. There was no division of historic sites, no program or department really. It was under the assistant director at that time. He basically wrote all the checks for when there were repairs done and things like that. It was a real small operation. There were 2 staff at the time. One was an archaeologist and the other was a historian who oversaw the field staff. And one of the great things that they did is started establishing the friends groups. So that was starting to come into place when I came on. So there was support out in the field for the site. Now you have to remember a lot of these sites are also run by the local community until they were turned over to the Historical Society, and sometimes even shared responsibility with the Historical Society for many years. So every site was different. It was a real hodgepodge of how things were done. But at that time, our staff out in the field were basically caretakers. Their 2 primary responsibilities were mow the grass and open the door and close it at night. And that's the way it was for many, many years, just because the focus was here really at the time with all the other departments and things. So the sites were there. They were often referred to as a stepchild of the Historical Society, but the people out there did do their part, given programs and trying to get people interested in the sites. So I consider 1988 a really big year for the Historical Society. That year, the director prior to Raymond Powers, Dr. Powers, was retiring, Joe Snell. And Raymond was hired, and Raymond's in the back, by the way. Glad you're here, Raymond. The way I remember it, Joe kind of mentored you for a period of time because the assistant director had retired before you came on. So there was some overlap, and Raymond was being mentored by Joe. The other thing that was happening at that time, besides a new director coming on, the legislature wanted us out of our building downtown. And that was the whole impetus for us building this one. And so Joe had created a new position or agency, which I became the director of facilities. And my number 1 priority was to develop a construction budget for the legislature in 1988, by which we would have to live by, even though we'd never even thought about this building before. So, and then once we got the appropriation, then I worked with the architect to develop the plans and just identifying all our needs in the building. So again, that was a big assignment. And then beyond that, afterwards, I would be the liaison to the architect for the agency, for the construction and all of that when we built the building. In addition to that, my job at that time was facilities, all the facilities, including the historic sites. In those days, we didn't call them state historic sites, and I'll talk to you about that a little bit later, but we just call them the sites, or the historic sites sometimes. I was responsible for the preservation and development and maintenance, all the physical aspects. And the responsibility for the programming and the interpretation, the artifacts, and that sort of thing, and the staffing was placed under the museum. So I was doing the buildings, museum was doing all the other activities at the sites. Well, after a period of time, well, fortunately, we'd gotten some money from the legislature. The legislature had started showing some interest. There had been some monies come through before I came on to do maintenance. The problem was no one figured out what that was to be spent on. So the money wasn't being spent, and the legislature was getting a little nervous about that. So one of the first jobs Raymond and I had was go to the legislature and say, look, we have no plans, no priorities. Give us some time to do a preservation plan, and then we'll spend this money and more. And they okayed that. So they bought off on that. So we got a reprieve on that. So that would lead me to my first big issue we face, but you might want to wait till we get to Goodnow on that.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. And then we'll also talk about one of the more unfortunate acronyms we had, SIT, the Sites Interpretive Team, right? So,
Yeah. We sat a lot
here is
in meetings.
Here is the monument today after 4 tornadoes and a much diminished obelisk. So I think, and one of our to-do list is to get an appropriate interpretation of where Lieutenant Pike actually visited. So that's on the to-do list. But her sign's still up there. It's still a great sight to see. And again, the building, the architecture, this is one of the ones where the state, much like this building, did a great job.
Yeah.
And that building in itself, I think, is eligible for the National
Yes, I agree.
for architecture. So in 1901, a lot happened, 3 things. But the legislature also asked that that we request a certain stone building to be granted to the state of Kansas by Congress. But this was then, we'll get there, it's on the property of Fort Riley, federal property, but instead the War Department in 1901 issued KSHS a revocable license. So what were we wanting to get so bad then? Well, this was what it is. Do we ever get buildings in great shape? Yeah,
No,
we'll do a little bit later.
This is par for the course.
So 1901, we did get it. And so what did we do with it? Well, I think we just added that sign, at least until 1927. What is this? So this is the first territorial capital in Kansas. And again, I said we weren't going to go into all the history of the sites, but for 4 days in 1855, which I think would be a pretty good movie title, actually, 4 days, the legislature met here. It was the Governor Reeder who actually had a financial interest in the town of Pawnee. This building was being constructed as a warehouse. It had neither roof nor floor, doors, or windows when they moved here. I think, what is the 37 of the 39 members of the territorial legislature were pro-slavery members. He was wanting to get them as far away from Missouri as possible, and this was it on the edge of the territory. But it didn't really work. They met for 4 days. One of the legislators complained that it had no floor, but by working all day Sunday and Sunday night, they did get a roof and floor finished, but the doors were not. They were open air for the session. So for those 4 days, the only thing they passed over the governor's veto was a bill adjourning the Shawnee Indian Mission, which is going to come up here in a little bit too, for the second territorial capital. So at that time, the legislature left, the town peoples pretty much left when it was discovered it was in fact on federal property. So yeah, no floors or roof when the legislature got there, and wasn't when we got it either. This is where we entered them. At our first session with Raymond, we talked about the society through the successive administrations. And William Connolly, the 4th Secretary of the Historical Society, did a lot for the historic sites in 2 ways. One, with this property, he began in the early 20s working to try to get funding to restore or reconstruct what we would call that building today. And finally, in 1927, he convinced Union Pacific Railroad to commit $20,000 toward the reconstruction. And this is maybe par for the course, but we finally, after a couple of attempts, got the state legislature to contribute 2,000. So, and we
That's
also
about
had
the
to,
right percentage.
right, we also had to get a right of way from the railroad. So let me see where, so wow, we didn't have it. We had the Union Pacific Railroad architects actually designed that. Great calligraphy, the lettering. So they went to town, and in 1928, it was completed. We had an official dedication. The Union Pacific ran special trains for the event. It was addressed by Governor Ben Paulson. A mock legislative session was held, and this was all broadcast by radio station KSHS out of Manhattan. So it was a big deal. So I just want to show you what happens when you let railroad engineers design a
Yep.
roof. You know, we didn't have it twice, but this is probably our best roof building of all the sites.
It'll never fail.
I pretty much think that would support a steam locomotive even.
The
So-
story is you could put a tank on that floor from Fort Riley and it would be just fine.
Yeah. So a little side issue here. While we only have a revocable license, if we don't operate it as a museum, it goes back to the federal government. But there is property there, and that's our 1940 caretaker cottage. And it's just kind of cute as a button. And it was actually designed by the state architect. This is also evolving a little bit, some state involvement. But I mainly put this on here to talk about what did we do with caretakers? So we housed them early on. But before that cute cottage was built, boxcar house now used for caretakers' residence. Isn't that great?
It's right there.
Yeah, right in the middle. I think you had to cross several active lines to get to it. So things have improved. So Terry, tell us when you came in 1990, we were still housing.
Yeah, we had about half the sites with caretakers' quarters. This was well, I shouldn't say by far. Pawnee Indian Museum was the best one. It was built with the new building,
Built
but
intended, right?
in the new building. But this little cottage was probably the next best one. The rest of them, I would not even go in hardly, you know. Some of them were basements that were dug out later. One of them had water coming through the wall, just a spring, because it was
That
built
was
in
a
the spring.
feature, not a bug.
Yeah. Except for, you know, after a period of time when the
Little-
clothes would start molding and things, I got a few complaints on that.
A lot of paper.
And the other issue was, since only half the people had housing, they didn't feel that it was fair because it was provided to them, to the others. So there was always discussion from part of the curators, they were going to sue the state because they weren't being treated fairly. So when I came in, I looked at the condition of all these places, and Raymond and I decided we're going to get rid of all the caretakers' quarters with the exception of Pawnee Indian Museum, since it was in good condition. And that site was so remote that we really couldn't protect it.
And I
at
believe
night.
to make the salaries consistent, there
Yep.
became a rent agreement out that. And when Richard Gould retired,
Yeah.
2017, 18,
Yeah.
recently,
Yeah.
not recently, that was the last on-site.
Yeah,
period.
he was the last on site, and he had to pay a small fee to make it more equitable.
Yeah.
But otherwise, if we'd have had to put, that's just one more building to take care of, and we had at our sites about 50 some buildings anyway, of which had not been maintained for many, many years. So, even though this cottage looked beautiful, Patrick, it had water coming through the roof when I came on, and
Terry,
it was just sort of like,
We've got a volunteer agreement, thanks to Ray there. We've got air conditioning in there now. You might want to reconsider.
yeah.
So this is a good point to talk about you mentioned the names of the sites, branding consistency. We have a few more. The upper right hand, First Capital of Kansas, that was one of our earliest, at least signs to denote the sites that I'm aware of. It's that heavy cast, like a lot of historical interest markers that you see. And in fact, right below it is a true historic marker, the state's official marker program. Originated in the 30s, really kicked off in 1940 with our agency and the Highway Department being the primary two, or now KDOT, the two entities responsible for it. And then most recently, we have signage, which we'll see later are new ones, but where we try to do everything with one sign, and it's less successful. So it wasn't, though, what you mentioned, until 88 to 90s that we started trying to call everything state historic sites
Yes.
to distinguish us from a local park or a state park.
Right. So many of the sites had been run by the local organizations, and they were basically local museums. At that time, we really had very few, if any, artifacts at most of these sites that were owned by the state. So the locals put what they wanted to put in there.
A lot of local history museums.
Local history museums, and that was just fine. But when Raymond came on, he and I had a lot of discussions, deep discussions, what's the future of the sites. Raymond, being from Gove, small town, Kansas, saw a lot of opportunity in the state historic sites, that here was another face for the public to access the State Historical Society. Not everybody gets to Topeka, and he could attest to that. And so I think there's a real mindset then that we need to promote these sites. We need to uplift them. Now, that didn't always go over so well in the local community. We had to bring them along too, but we started by calling them state historic sites. What do you expect when you see, we looked at other states and see what they were doing. State historic site had a certain, just level of integrity and quality about it that we wanted to achieve. So we started promoting ourselves that way. And that was a huge change. There'd been no money spent on promotion and prior till the 1980 or so. I think there was one brochure before that that was out of print within a few months after it was printed. And that's the only older brochure I saw in the whole sites program prior to 1988. So.
And that's a recurrent issue now. We desperately need a new brochure, but things get out of date.
Yeah.
Adding and subtracting sites. So let's move on to the other 1901 property. And this one really deserves an asterisk, kind of like several of them do, but Fort Hays. And this is one of my favorite buildings, the Block House, and it's probably, along with Shawnee Indian Mission, is where some of the most money's been spent over the years. And this picture is right after some of our most recent work, cleaning the stone, block replacement, which I know one of those programs of block replacement was when you were there.
Yep.
In the early 90s. So Fort Hays, one of the famous forts in Western history, originally Fort Fletcher in 1865. It was relocated to the current site after a big flood in 67. And it was built to protect trade on the Butterfield Overland Dispatch / Smoky Hill Trail. This in 1901, the legislature, let's go back a little bit. It was until 1889, it was active, and then it was known as the Fort Hays Military Reservation. And so it was abandoned, and that's what it looked like. And the state, the 1901, accepted the property for 3 defined uses. And we're talking thousands of acres. I forgot to write it down how much, but an experimental ag station, which is still there for K-State, and for a college, which the western branch of the Kansas State Normal School, now Fort Hays State University. And finally, kind of into park, right? Well, so that was 1901. It's a date we use, but really nothing as far as a state historic site happened in. A couple of statutes in 27, apparently it didn't really take, because another one in 31 created Frontier Historical Park. That time only 2 properties were remaining from the original fort, the Block House and the Guard House. There's a commemorative postcard from that era. But 31, there we go, the requisite governor dedication. I believe that is, who are we talking about? Woodring, maybe, yes, Governor Woodring in 1931 in front of the guardhouse. So the fort, again, was a huge fort with multiple buildings, and apparently, after 1889, all of the buildings were distributed, moved around, and the officers' quarters, a defining feature, and we see it in its heyday, and then when it was abandoned. But we found at least the start one in town, and it was moved in the early 60s, which brings us to an important thing. And this is what affects what you were addressing earlier. In 1963, there was legislation that brought 5 of these other state-owned sites that the Historical Society hadn't had a role in, unless it was as a board, member of a general board of trustees, under our direct supervision. And then again, still another asterisk in 74, finally those boards were abolished. But so in 63, and you see it was a park. We see picnic shelters.
Yep.
So 63 was the time when we get on. And so it was an era This is the same 1966 legislature that authorized the visitor center at Pawnee Indian Museum, did the one at Hayes. And in this case, I think we moved on from that caretaker to trying to follow in the footsteps of the Park Service and their Mission 66, where they were moving on from their older rustic area of lodges and cabins to a visitor center concept where orientation for the visitors, education, restrooms, important things, gift shops, concessions, public safety and administration can be combined into a on-site building. And so I think this, without digging in it, I think we must have been emulating that to a degree
I believe
with
we
Pawnee
probably were.
Indian Museum and Fort Hayes. So that building was built in 66, although the other one we lagged here, didn't open until 69. But so that started, and eventually we got another officers' quarters. And so today we have the 4 historic buildings on that. Well, much bigger story there. We lease land to the city for a golf course.
Yes.
And we have to answer questions like what was Custer's handicap and so. And just lastly, I think that's still a darn fine sign, but this illustrates your earlier point. It just says, come see old Fort Hayes. And old was used in a lot of the naming.
Most of them were old.
Yep. And professionally, we went away from that, but it's still a darn good sign. Another interesting property, and you see some dates there. And again, this is another one that we didn't become involved until the 60s, after that 63 legislation. But in order of it being acquired by the state for its historic significance, the next one we have is Pawnee Rock in 1908. There it is in 1918. It was a neat story. Benjamin Unruh donated to the state in 1908. So he donated the site, but he wanted to sell the land necessary for the road to the site.
Yeah.
So the Women's Kansas Day Club raised the money to acquire the roadway and erect a suitable monument on the ground, right? And also their charge was to restore the rock to the original form. So now Pawnee Rock was significant because it was a famous and indigenous Native American history, but also as a point, a visual landmark along the Santa Fe Trail. So, but by the early 1900s, the top of the rock had been quarried for the railroad bed and the foundations of the town of Pawnee Rock. So this is interesting. Restore the rock to its original form, provide the preservation of the place as a public memorial of the incidents which gave it historic interest. I found that curious language. So that's a great view from 1918. And there they did. In 1912, they got the monument put up. And look at that obelisk. Wow, we like monuments. It's apparently was a 30-foot shaft of bar granite designed by an Italian sculptor from Topeka. Who knew? Weighed 30,000 pounds. Freight from Topeka, $28. I wish we could get rates like that now. We can't mail a package to the site for that anymore. So yet again, special trains. That's the big Santa Fe. An ex-governor here, Hoke, and we have, well, I've seen 7,000, 8,000 spectators for the dedication of that monument. So
that monument was supposed to emulate the full height of the rock.
Well, wait a minute. We got another story coming up
we got
with the
more.
pavilion. Yes, maybe, right. It was there. We've heard another one. So we had that. It was administered by the Pawnee Rock Historical State Park Board of Trustees. That's what they called it. But then in 1920, this is what I was told, the pavilion was supposed to replicate.
Oh, the building.
So if you go to the top of that pavilion, that approximates the original height of the rock. And if you're not looking toward the city of Pawnee Rock and you see our interpretive signs, and this raises a thing, over the years, our sites have changed categories. We have year-round sites, seasonal sites, and then sites open to vandalism year-round, like Pawnee Rock. So, and Jenny said, our previous predecessor, Jenny Chan, said, when we have to replace these signs, we'll just pre-print the bad words on them, save the vandals the trouble. So, but you see our interpretive trail, and if you look there, you see the rock. But if you do look to the east and you squint and the wind's from the north, so you don't hear the 18-wheelers on Highway 56, I can just imagine a oxen train bound for Santa Fe coming over that hill. So it is a great sight for you to go see.
Yeah, I think when I came on, this was probably our most vandalized site.
Yeah.
And we struggled with that for years and years. We just kept trying to build more vandal proof, which there is no such thing. But we work very closely with all the communities. Help us out here. Will you help monitor us? Will you call the sheriff if you see somebody? And first they wouldn't, but over time they did. But you have to keep doing that over and over because people turn over. And over time, then it would slip and it would get worse again. So we'd go back and forth at a lot of these sites. It's a full-time job just working with the communities.
And again, we don't have good luck with monuments. Now, with
No.
1938 lightning strike and what happened, we do
Yeah.
not have a 30-foot obelisk there anymore, so. And I mentioned historical markers. I found a photo in the files of one of the original 1941 rustic ones. That's pretty cool, actually. So next in the order of when the state acquired it, and is the John Brown Museum. And this didn't come about John Brown. It came about when the Women's Relief Corps purchased 22.5 acres of the historic Battle of Osawatomie, the ground, the site where John Brown fought with the pro-slavery forces. And they agreed in 1909 to donate it to the state for a memorial park, which didn't actually happen until 1911 when the legislature accepted it. They renamed it John Brown Memorial Park. And then the following year appropriated $2,800 to relocate the historic Adair cabin just north of town, northwest of town, where Brown had stayed during all of the Bleeding Kansas days, to move to the park so the public could see it. And so that happened, and then there it is. And then by 1928 is severe deterioration. So the stone pavilion, which actually now causes us more maintenance issues than the cabin itself, was built to protect the cabin. Again, this was another deal with the Board of Trustees. 63, it came underneath our supervision. Interesting thing, this was a little different. In 65, it's like, we don't want to be running this 22-acre park. So we leased that to the city of Osawatomie. And then in 1996, maybe this in Goodnow House is when the partnership historic site agreement. So do you want to talk about that?
Sure. We're going to jump up ahead here to the mid 90s from 88 to 90. But we were in between that, we thought we were doing pretty good. We were getting a lot of, and we'll talk more about this, but we're getting a lot of grants. We were getting money. We were making improvements at all of the state historic sites, building some new visitor centers. We're feeling pretty good, but somebody in the legislature says, I think you have too many. So I think we need to get rid of a few. So we're going to write a bill. We're going to take 4 away. Tell me which ones you want. Well, that's like pouring gasoline on a fire because every community thinks their site is the most important and the only one. So how do you go about choosing those 4? And of course, the legislature knew that. They were not going to choose it. We had to choose it. If you remember that, Raymond. And we did a lot of study, a lot of meetings in the community. No one was happy about it, but they just wanted to close it. The legislature just wanted to close them. But we finally came up with a proposal back to them saying, we might be able to get a partnership for the communities where we could give them some seed money and eventually they would take over operating it. The person that wrote the bill didn't care for that, but he finally agreed to that approach, but gave us like a 2-year window. But I figured 2 years is better than none. And we did write agreements with 4 communities to help us run these sites. And that went on at least on several of them for quite some time. That person then was not reelected, and so that push wasn't there anymore. But we set up this partnership, and that worked very well. We carefully chose them where there were strong local community groups that could help. One being the Goodnow House in Manhattan, which is right beside the Riley County Historical Society. They were there more often than we were anyway. And so they ran that one for us. John Brown, the same way, we got them to run that site. We no longer staffed it, but we did put money towards whatever, utility bills or staffing, whatever they wanted to use it for.
And we'll talk a little bit more about this later. And also to point out, the little building in the background was, you guessed it, the caretaker's cottage.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we get to another moment, and the other one that William Connolly was instrumental in acquiring in 1927, Shawnee Indian Mission became the state historic site, and was by substantial assistance by lots of organizations, but basically led by the colonial dames. So here's an early illustration, just a background, and this was in 1839. It actually started a little earlier, but on this site, the Shawnee Methodist Mission, at one time was over 2,000 acres.
Yep.
And by the 20s, there were, I forget, 15 acres and 3 main buildings left. And so there'd been a lot of, even the annual reports mentioned, there was a lot of requests from people to save the building. And so Connolly tried. And finally, the legislature approved it. So this is what it looked at. That's the East Building in the 20s. That's the oldest picture we have of the West Building. And it looks like that now, again, thanks to you, Terry, but it looked like this when we got it in the 20s. So some of them had changes. Another interesting sign, this is the first one I found where we used the pointy finger, like you see at Branson and all. So, but back to how we got it. This was the first time in Kansas history that a property was acquired by eminent domain for historic preservation purposes. And that's because some of the landowners, it wasn't one landowner, refused to sell. And so the state used eminent domain. It was challenged and upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1928. So we went to more trouble to acquire this property than any of the other state court sites. So, and so this one is one that there's a long history, and you could do several programs just about it. And then using some federal New Deal money in the late 30s, early 40s to restore and rebuild the North Building. And then those various organizations redeveloped, research, and did the period rooms. And so great history there, but for our purpose in 27. Now, so at this point, even though we mentioned those others, when you look at annual reports, they never talk about Pike's Pawnee Village, as it was known, because there was nothing to do. Occasionally they talk about depositing $2.25 from the hay, from people, the farmer haying it. First Territorial, there's talks about money and staffing, and then Shawnee Indian Mission. And that's the way it is up until World War II, because those were really the only 3 sites that the society directly administered. Just no one showing in the 50s, lots of people eager to go see the North Building. And it's a good point to point out. If you've not noticed, we've been name calling lots of either important women or women's patriotic and service organizations. They were the prime pusher of the time. Historic preservation, saving these historic sites. And they don't probably get enough due. So 1941, we get several more things come at least to state hands again. You see all those other numbers and you see 1963, it means we weren't involved. Well, the Meridacine Massacre site in Lynn County, site of one of the Bleeding Kansas, the pro-slavery folks massacred several folks. And it was also the site of John Brown's fort after the massacre. One of his friends, Charles Hadsell, owned the property after that, let John Brown be stationed there and build that, and later built the Hadsell House. So in 1941, I believe it is, the County Commission of Lynn County donated the site. Also, the Pleasanton Veterans of Foreign Wars Post donated additional 60 acres. So that's the 2 counties. There was a board where we were a member of the board. And here's the dedication. I didn't write down which governor's there, but as you can see by the car and the uniforms, it's a great time. You can see, again, you got another fixer-upper on hand. And but we did. We fixed it up. Look at that. Or the state did, because we weren't directly involved then. But you mentioned vandalism. Wow. When 1963, that legislation, we have a report, and it was so bad that they even talked about taking it down, because you can see from the front, the windows blown out, it was severely vandalized. But we did. We did rebuild it, but took off 1 floor, and our site caretaker lived there on the middle floor. Now you mentioned the moldiness. This is bottom.
The indoor waterfall.
There is a active spring, and they actually piped it on that left side. It's kind of neat, actually, but it wasn't the best living quarters, and it's very remote. What, maybe 200 yards from the Missouri border. So we blame Missourians for all that vandalism, right? Also 1941, Hollenberg Pony Express Station. So this is one, Terry, where another one for the 1963, one where there was no board of trustees. It was just run by the local county, or actually, I think the county chapter of the Oregon Trail Association, I believe, Washington County, until 1963. And then I know we'd moved in a house and then moved it out, but then during your time, we built a modern visitor center in the mid-90s.
Right.
So,
Yep. Well, when we put together a preservation plan, plans are always a great idea, and you have to have
got
some.
shelves full of them.
Yeah, we have shelves full of them, but our approach at that time was we were going to do the emergency stabilization and preservation work first. We had so many buildings that needed immediate work that were in danger of falling down. And we had visitor center in the back of our mind, but sometimes those things get pushed forward. It depends on the legislature. It can depend upon a wealthy donor. It can depend upon the community. There are a whole lot of factors. This one, there was a study done by the National Park Service on the Oregon-California Trail, and they thought that that trail needed a visitor center. And they looked at what they would do for a visitor center and staffing. Well, their report came back saying they'd build a $3 million visitor center with 21 staff. That's bigger than our whole program by far. And they shared that with the community. And one of our centers got involved at that time and said, that's a great idea, state, you should do that. And of course, everybody in the state legislature just laughed, and we weren't pushing for it because we knew it wasn't feasible. And so the talk came about, well, how about, well, the ante got up because the senator said, well, I can get $1 million through the federal government, but the state has to put in too. And we couldn't do it. And we had a really rough relationship with the community for a period of time because they kept saying, well, why can't you come up with the $2 million? Well, you know, you just can't get $2 million out of for a small historic site out of the legislature. Just isn't going to happen. And that was prior to before we were getting all these grants and things. So this got really moved up. We felt enough pressure that we did get a grant, and we built this small visitor center and moved the caretaker out of the historic Pony Express station, which is a small building anyway, and put exhibits and things in here in addition to those over to the station, Pony Express station. So this is one where your planning just kind of gets shoved to the side and you're kind of forced to do something. So, and we did, and it worked out really well. I think it was very good for the visitation up there.
And this is one where the initial plan was we would have multi-staff because this is several hundred yards from the Pony Express.
Yep.
A great trail walks there. You get a
Right.
great experience. But our folks now, when you run it with one person, some places left alone.
Well, this is a site also, and I'll tell a little story here. About the second day I was on the job, I got a phone call from the Friends president up there and said, hey, Terry, where do you want the concrete? I said, what concrete? He says, we're pouring today. I said, what are you pouring? He says, we're going to attach a picnic shelter to this building, to the Pony Express station, because we need a picnic shelter up here, because it was their site, they felt, and they needed picnic facilities and that sort of thing.
And let's just say this is the only extant station house on the entire Pony Express route.
Yeah.
And so it's National Historic Landmark.
Right.
Super significant.
Yeah. And talked them out of it, but they were never very happy about that. So I told them at some point we would build a visitor center, and I had to kind of live up to my word. There wasn't going to be anything inside that building other than the Pony Express station. So I didn't want to we had an architect do a design for us in which you would have to walk through a building to see this building. And we took it to the community and they literally walked out. They hated it.
You had a lot of friends over the years.
Pardon?
You had a lot of friends.
Right? Yeah, I had a lot of friends. So we bought some additional property and planted it all back to native grass so we wouldn't have to mow it. And actually we could bail it twice a year and make some money. So, and
Tell us about where those stairs lead to. It's not a basement living quarters.
no, that's the, we put a Clevis Multrum in this. We couldn't get
Which is a compostable
a
toilet.
compostable toilet. We couldn't get the county to approve a septic
Mhm.
system for us. We could only put in a lagoon and it was going to be the primary view on the whole site because it was the lowest point. We couldn't do that. So we had to come up with another solution and came up with this Clevis Multrum,
And part of that
which I thought was a
because
great, and the stuff in it composted. You could put it out on the gardens and stuff, but
it still works to this day.
yeah,
Terry purchased the deluxe model, and I think we use about a quarter of the features now, but we still keep it maintained. Feed it
Yeah.
the wood chips regularly, and it's happy.
yeah, and it's very easy to maintain, but
Yep.
the community just never did care for it too much. But we didn't really have any other choices, either that or a
But
lagoon.
part of it was because they were considering us like a high volume manufacturing,
Yes.
whereas our
Yep.
flushes would not have warranted that lagoon.
Right. I mean, ultimately the county had the jurisdiction, but every engineer we talked to said that's not good. The fact that they wanted us to do a lagoon was insane. A septic system would have been more than adequate for our needs, but we never could get it approved. So we ended up with the Clevis Multrum.
And this is the point that no one mentions when you're going to college for history or thinking you're getting the glamorous world of
Yeah.
preservation. Yep. We spend a lot of time about that, don't we, Ray? All right, well, moving on. So in 1951, Commission, Council Grove, um, probably it was 1850, 51. It's one of the earliest buildings in Kansas, and it was an offshoot of the mission of Shawnee Indian Mission. It was a school for the Kaw for a few years. The Huffaker family, who was the first missionary, it was his son Carl owned it and wanted to sell it to the state. It had been remodeled into his house in 27. And it's also our most recently reinterpreted site, opened a couple years ago. But so we get it in 1951. The legislature agrees to purchase the house. And again, we have great timing with a lot of things. What happens? The 1951 flood. Let me get caught up here a minute, where are my pages? So it took a couple years. We applied for some emergency funding and it was not required, it was denied. And so in 52, a year later, we finally got some funds. And it was opened up as a museum in that year. And this is one where our caretakers, a family, live, husband and wife, upstairs. And we have, I hope we could publish it someday, I'm not sure, but we have some wonderful correspondence on file from them to the society because the owner, Carl Huffaker, lived with them for at least 6 months while his house was being constructed. And it would make a modern sitcom, their complaint. So,
yeah.
And here's an example. You're going to talk, well, thank goodness, coming up here in a second anyway, about the push-pull between museum disciples and preservation and what happened, whether they're black box museums. And at Commission, I didn't include an interior because I hope you go to it, but it's one of them when we struck that balance, I think pretty good, of having modern exhibits in it, but restoring the building, the house to see it. You're not blocking off the windows or that. And I want to include this. This is an example of our newest stop of signage. Again, simple, so-called monumental sign. We're not trying to put our hours of operation, our website, all those things that change on it like we saw at First Territorial. We have some of that information on a smaller sign when you get the interest, but that's the new look for the State Historic Sites. I hope you approve, Terry.
Yeah, it's great.
If you don't, it's Ray's idea.
Yeah.
About this time, and I include this only because it says a survey of historic sites and structures, 1957, the legislature basically told the society to do that. I think they may have, how many more of these are going to be coming into state hands down the line? A lot of it, though, the recommendation was for status quo or local marker. So I don't know if it really worked, but it does show that the state was still thinking, what do we have in Kansas worthy of preservation? Next on our list is Grenner Place, State Historic Site, 1968. This is one that's a little bit different in that it was authorized to be acquired and managed by us, but that the funds for the purchase were raised by the Friends of Grinter Place. So that happened in 71. And this is the one where we excavated the basement, where again, we got to make our caretaker suffer, right? And so they lived in the basement. And any things on there? I know that there was a historic barn that burned. The Friends have a site there. We've gone back and forth. Our office has been in their building. We've recently moved it back to the house, so visitors know where to go. Anything you can share? The best thing about Terry is find him after hours sometimes. Anything you can share on it? Anything, I mean, it's just always a push-pull, right?
Yeah,
Local.
Grinter's a real example of things flip in a hurry, depending on who the board is. Sometimes we're allowed in their building. We own adjacent properties. We had to build a separate bathroom unit outside because they didn't want us using the public using their facilities. So it's just one of the, and then the next group would come in, so, well, you could have used ours, but, so it's always back and forth. And I think Grinter was one of those examples that you never knew what you were going to get into when you went there, just depending on who was on the board, because the way it tended to work there, when one of them would get mad, the whole group would quit. So it'd be all new people. So we'd be starting over with their board all the time. And I know our site carriers over there just were really frustrated because we'd be moving them in their barn, in the Friends barn, which is a great facility to be used, a good place for the public because they have a nice big parking lot in front to come up and get oriented there. And then the Friends group tour people could take them over to the house and give them tours. It never really worked that way. So it's just,
we're back at the house. We have great relations with the Friends groups. All of them. We're streaming live.
We do. Over time, we always do, but it's just.
But the other thing is we do have probably the largest parking lot for a state historic site because prior to our owning it, it was a very popular chicken and successful chicken restaurant.
Yep.
So I think that's a future fundraising idea. We're going to get some food trucks out there. We need a couple 100,000 to resurface the parking lot, though. You can find some for us.
Yeah, that's for sure.
So Goodnoe House. So 1969, another one where the state, it was the legislature in 69 authorized it, and it was donated, but we didn't formally accept it until it was restored. It's a little bit different twist on the Grinter Place. And we didn't get some federal funds in 72 also to help with it. So this is the one where Riley County, the neighbor, we deeded some land to them so they could put their museum, and then that partnership, which works really great there. But this particular one on how we were going to use the state historic site is probably the best one to illustrate the push-pull within our divisions here at the Historical Society.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest issues we faced right away was when I was in charge of the building and the museum was in charge of the interpretation and the exhibits, was what happens to the interior of the building. And the museum philosophy at that time was, we're putting artifacts in here, it has to be perfect environmental conditions.
The black box.
The black box, if you will. So those windows need to be bricked in. So I can't do that. I'm also a preservationist. So we had a lot of discussions for a long period of time.
And wasn't there also an idea that rather than concentrating on Isaac Goodnoe, who was an early Free State abolitionist, founder of Bluemont College, to be more like a satellite museum, a mini version of what we had here?
Well, that was some of the philosophy at the time. I think that because that side of the sites have been moved under the museum, their thought at that time that all the sites were going to be satellite museums. So that's how people are going to access them. So that they anticipated putting artifacts out there, and therefore they wanted really good conditions. We could improve them, but we could never meet their criteria. And I think the bricking of the windows is what broke the camel's back. Because fairly quickly we had a big discussion, and I remember their own historian, and I'll give his name, he's passed on, Dale Watts, really kind of saved us. He says, well, what's the real artifact here? Isn't it the building? Isn't that why we own these things? And that's really what turned the tide. And so there's a major change, and our museum director left. Raymond put all the sites under me then, so I was responsible for the staffing as well as the interpretation. Thanks, Raymond.
You still have hair, Terry.
Yeah, I got some. No, I really embraced that we needed to come from a common direction. And that's the one that really started making some changes at the sites. Money was becoming available and we
What
now
was
can
that
move
time
forward.
for?
Yeah, well, we were at a very fortunate time. At first, the legislature was very supportive. We got some money from them. And at first they funded 100% of our sites program. Then they asked us to raise 20%. Then it went to 50. Then it went to 20. And then, we had to keep them in for 20 because we always had to have a match. But we got a lot of transportation enhancement grant funds and other funds to spend at sites. We spent millions of dollars at the sites. So, and that had never happened before. And I don't know if it'll ever happen again, really, but we hope, but.
Yeah, we have to kind of nickel and dime some of our
Yeah.
approaches without the big appropriation.
Yep.
So
Yeah, but
we're gonna move on. I think we hit the main topics that we
Yep.
want to talk to with you, but we're gonna get to the end of our sites here and then we'll open it up for questions here.
Okay.
So, but the next one, well, here's one that I love because one, that's the Goodnoe barn that was used as the initial visitor center before Riley County was built. We're currently right now rehabilitating that building for a third-party use programming space, hands-on workshops, window repair, et cetera. But I love that someone really wanted that second floor window for that brick chimney to have to take that torturous path around it. So one of my favorite shots.
there's a will, there's a way.
So it's also it's worth mentioning that because sites started first, the Historic Preservation Act came around in 1966 and we had the National Register. People use terms, interchangeable. I know
Mhm.
you as state historic sites people would call you wanting to put a property really on the National Register. So we're trying to brand and promote state historic site means a state-owned, KSHS managed historic site. But we also have National Register listings, the National Historic Landmark. I mentioned that earlier. It's the highest designation. And all of our sites are listed on the National Register, and 7 out of 26, well now 27, Quindaro just got listed, are National Historic Landmarks. So just a little far. So Mine Creek Battlefield State Historic Site, near Pleasanton, 74, another one of your visitor centers. I think this one was probably more successful than the one at Hollenberg. It's a great site.
Yeah.
All that glass fenestration looking out over the battlefield. My dream is to use one of those movies for the transparent glass that then the cavalry charge
Yep.
mounted. It's a great site. Here's one that it's worth mentioning that is a state historic site. We haven't really defined what it is. It's state, either by statute or within our budget, a state-owned property. And we have one that we don't publicize, that has its own statute and property, and that's Tobias. And it was an archaeological site originally meant to be somewhat like Pawnee Indian Museum with a visitor center that never materialized for a variety of reasons, but it is a state historic site. I know we had several archaeological field schools there, most recently in 2019. So here we had promoted that we had a plan for the site. Again, it didn't come out, maybe in the future, but it's also very remote. There's no paved roads.
Right.
And you again worrying about vandalism or destruction of resources. So 1982 Cottonwood Ranch. This is why I said about the state statute, because this was just authorized in our budget legislation, not a standalone statute. Our original intent here was to be a living history farm. So you want to spend a couple of minutes on what happened and what didn't really?
That was why it was accepted to be a living history farm. It was supposed to be like the one up in Montana. I can't think of the name of it right now. Living History Ranch.
And
the problem
Pratt was a sheep,
he was a sheep farmer.
Yeah.
The problem with this one was we only got 23 acres with it. And also the legislature wanted to be self-supporting. It takes 7 acres of land for each sheep. We could have 3 1/3 sheep, or 2/3. I'm sorry.
The return on
We
investment
just couldn't figure out how to ever make
going to
it
cash
work.
flow. Right. And we don't have the population centers.
Yeah,
like, say,
and it was.
Happy,
How many
Stick Ships.
people here have been to Studley?
Studley, Kansas, right here. Yep.
Historical Society people, for the most part. Yeah. Yeah. The famous thing about Studley is it's the most stolen traffic,
highway sign.
highway sign in Kansas. Everybody wants to sign Studley, so they can't keep them out there. But
That
anyway,
would be a gift shop idea.
yeah,
There we go.
well, we did make them for a while, so,
Okay, well,
yeah.
we'll bring
yeah.
that one back.
But it was just so remote that it just never would pay off, and we didn't have the funds to run it long term at that time.
So in your time, we have Constitution Hall.
Yep.
I didn't get to include a lot of photos. Purchased this right before Raymond and you came along, but opened in 95. So I don't feel so bad about the museum gallery taking a few years to reopen, but you had to do a lot of major stabilization work.
Yeah.
Again, this was the third, or the official actually named territorial capital. It's where the pro-slavery constitution was written. There you see him, Jim Lane addressing a crowd there. But when we got it, it's probably the oldest frame structure in Kansas, and it's a balloon frame, meaning the 2x4s go the entire 2-story length. So what challenges did you have?
Well, this building, in my opinion, only survived because termite tunnels held it up. I crawled under that thing and there were just termite tunnels everywhere. And most of the wood never even came to the ground. It's amazing how wood structures survive when you get them all put together. If you can't build them so they stand up unless you build them right. But once you get the siding on it and all that, but there are so many holes in it that the wind went right through it. So that's the only reason it survived. This is this balloon framing he was talking about. It goes clear up through the second floor. The termites had eaten off every one of these. And we had places where they'd nail up, they call these sisters they put beside them, they nail it. Termite would eat that one off. They'd put another sister beside that. We had some of them are 4 sisters out. So the weight would come down here and jump over here. I don't know really why it stood. We got to it just in time. And it was an amazing project because we hired a guy to do this, who was an architect also. They had a construction company, and we lifted the building up in place and put this concrete underneath it and rebuilt the stone wall. Took the whole floor out of it because there was nothing left of the floor. So we got into some really interesting projects. We did the same thing up at kind of a similar thing up at Hollenberg, except for that one was strong enough we could actually set it off to the side. This one the only choice we had was to jack it up. It was about 6 to 8 feet above the ground. So thank goodness the wind didn't blow that over too.
Well, we didn't have a monument there, so it was pretty safe.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, then when I came was the most recent state historic site was the William Allen White House, also known as Red Rocks. This one's another one that came that has a statute, but specified that we can't use state general fund. So that's proving challenging to this day, that restriction. But it's also another one we got some significant federal funds to restore it and open it.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. We have a state historic site we can't use state funds on. It's just makes no sense to me.
We're working on that.
Yeah.
And then this is just, you mentioned before, you had historic structured reports or modified ones done for most all of the sites. And then by the time this one came along, I know KU was interested and they did some HABs drawings for it to document. And there's the governor speaking, Sebelius, and there's Terry and Jenny there at the requisite grand opening. 2015, Last Chance Store. This one was donated to the site by Connie Essington. I actually got to work on this one. I was involved with sites at the time. And it came through our budget bill, and it's administered through Commission State Historic Site. Again, having people in the 2 places at one time has been challenging to be opening. It's been semi-successful. It's a great building. Ray's now has it air conditioned. It's conditioned, so we could have some artifacts in there if we want. So that one, again, last chance on the Santa Fe Trail for beans, bacon, or whiskey before you got to Santa Fe. So at least that's the legend. And just last month, we finally acquired the Curtis House as our 17th state historic site. The statute actually dated from 1986. It was not acquired then. And last year, the 2024 legislature appropriated $300,000 to purchase it, which we just got done. We're working on plans to do new exhibits and to open soon. So we're excited about that. Again, Vice President Curtis Enter Hoover, the first vice president of color. He was a Caucasian. So we got a splendid interior too.
Yeah.
Absolutely wonderful. So talk just real quickly before we get to the end, because we are over time slightly. We didn't, part of the number are we've lost a couple. One was the Fred Funston house, which we got in 55, because General Funston, a hero of the Philippine Wars, lots of, I mean, a super well-known person. We had his house. But this was this one of the ones that was the victim of, you got a visitation, what?
Yeah, visitation. They also moved the highway. There was a branch of the highway that, I don't remember the highway number now, that went in front of it, but they moved it a couple miles away. So people just stopped coming. And we'd had some difficulty at the site with staffing and but the community was interested in the house. This is the complete farmstead, and which is still there, but then the group that took it over moved it into Iola, the house itself.
So it's still there and you can see it.
Yeah,
And it's interpreted,
not on
but
the
it's
original
not on
site.
its original site. And
Yeah, and it's definitely a farmhouse, and it looks a little different
a little
sitting in
different
town.
now,
But
but
again, we were really hard pressed with coming up with sites. Because every so often we get asked, we need to jettison some, and it's just sort of like, what do you do?
so, but at least it's there. And then the other one that more recently, the Iowa Sac and Fox mission, which was operated during your time after a SIT reinterpretation as the Native American Heritage Museum. It was one of those 1941 ones. We basically had a third of the mission building that was originally there. The rest is in Highland in the college, right?
Yeah.
And then 1963, actually, that's one of your additions on the side for an elevator and ADA accessibility. Previously, there was a one-story kind of add-on where the caretaker lived. But in 2020, it closed in 2009 as part since 2008. But every subsequent budget cut that our agency took, we were closing or doing partnership sites. That closed in 2009. There was outdoor signage, and it was transferred to the Iowa tribe in 2021.
Yeah. What are they using it for?
It's a museum.
Is it?
I haven't been up there since they're working on it, and we're working with them to get some artifacts up there as well. An interesting subcategory is KSHS owned sites that aren't state historic sites. One of the more interesting ones, I think, is Trading Post, which was donated to us in 1931 with the condition that we erect a suitable marker. Well, somehow we must have been tough, the Depression. We got a grave marker. That's what it looks like there. But it hasn't been hit by a tornado or lightning.
No, it's low enough.
Yeah.
It's down on a creek.
Maybe that's our new model. The beautiful site on the river. And so we hope to add some interpretation there. So like an outdoor interpretive kiosk and appropriate. There's a couple others. Mount Mitchell was one, a similar thing, donated, since transferred to the Audubon Society. We do have, you mentioned earlier, we have 56 buildings, 5 monuments, and 6 structures. So
how many cemeteries?
Oh my goodness, we're trying to transfer 1 to the Shawnee. We have at least 2, 3.
3.
So, yeah. Anyway, moving on. And this is one that's kind of fun, is the tri-state marker. And it's, I often joke, and it is a joke, it's one of my favorites because I get no complaints about it, and it does not have a budget item line, so for repair. But this is the tri-state marker. Way down the corner, you actually access it through the Quapaw Casino parking lot, apparently. What does the future hold? Well, you never know. And it's like you talk about push-pull when you get money in. And so one of the things that we had to kind of scramble the city of Osawatomie wants to improve the John Brown Park, and they actually had some money that was going to come out of last year's federal, or actually the current year, 25, that ended up being a continuing resolution towards a new visitor center. So if that comes through, then something like this could rise to the front. But that stone pavilion with a cabin inside and all those functions around it, the AD detracts from the visitor center. So this would be another help following in the model that you established at Hollenberg and Mine Creek to help better tell that story. So we'll see.
Good luck.
Well, thanks, Terry. Thanks for staying there. Are there any questions for Terry from the audience? All right. And the answer is yes, there will still be refreshments here in the next 10 minutes. So
Visitor Center. She would ask me dates. I didn't write them down.
Yeah.
Probably 95, 96.
We'll say mid-90s. It was very similar to Mine Creek. Weren't
Yeah.
they in the works at the same time?
Right. Yeah.
It's the recent history ones are the hardest dates to remember.
Any other questions from anybody?
Yeah, Terry.
Oh, I'll
Keys
get
are
in trouble
tired.
here.
You can
Yeah,
answer honestly.
I've
My
always-
answer
yeah.
is always whichever one I'm at that moment.
exactly. Well, you have to play that card. I don't know. I have several favorites. Pony Express is one I really like because it's still open enough. You can get a sense of the Pony Express coming over or the wagon trails that went along the Oregon, California trail because it was a roadhouse for a much longer
Mhm.
period of time. So,
Right.
so I've always liked that one. And that's why I would like to keep that site as pristine as possible. So,
And that's one where we went to a lot of effort. We got the walnut siding and an old style bandsaw to cut it. And we've
yeah, we had
a special formula for the preservative. We heat up
Right.
wax
Yep.
and mineral
Yeah, we
spirits
went the whole
and-
9 yards on that one.
Mhm.
So, but yeah, that was really great. The community couldn't believe we were cutting walnut trees and letting it dry for the siding. We matched exactly the siding, which was really gone on that. It had been painted a number of times before. It was the only reason anything was left.
And about 10 years or so ago, we had to do yet another. That was the bright boards that you saw in the earlier photograph.
Yep.
So it's a continual effort. So.
Yep, yep. I also like, in spite of all the difficulties we had there, I still like Cottonwood Ranch. It's just a beautiful, beautiful complex. I don't think it makes a good state historic site because that's not necessarily, I mean, sheep ranching in Kansas was pretty minuscule. I mean, if you're going to talk about ranching, it needs to be cattle. But,
Right.
but anyway, I just love the buildings out there though.
Mhm.
They're just incredible. And it's worth
Mhm.
a stop just for the
Absolutely.
architecture.
Yes.
So,
And that unique kind of Yorkshire plan of the way the outbuildings are
yep.
arranged.
yep. Yeah. I just wish we could have gotten it earlier before some of the buildings fell. And I
Right.
mean, we did,
The tornado took one out, I
Yep,
think, in
yep.
1912 or something. Tornadoes.
yeah,
for sure.
we've had our share of tornadoes and floods.
So we're still here. Well, thank you, Terry.
You're
Thank you so much. And
Yep.
we'll sign you up as a volunteer and keep you active.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you all so much for being here today. And thank you all for those who took the schoolhouse tour. I hope everyone can come back again next month, July 9th, same time, 6:30, to have an archives focus on Kansas rock before the band Kansas. So the early origins of rock and roll in Kansas in the 1960s. So thank you all very much and have a wonderful evening.